Cool.
Hey everyone, this is Derek, Chad, and Enrique with the Static Site Editor team. It's Monday, August 24th, I believe. And we're going to be just doing a quick sync on a planning doc for the editing front matter feature within the Static Site Editor. So that's what this is about. We might have some other people join as well, but I know a few aren't going to be able to make it. So we'll just kind of jump right in. So at a high level, kind of the goal of this is twofold, or basically single fold, I guess. The goal is to be able to edit front matter, not just in raw markdown, but in actual dedicated controls in WYSIWYG mode. So again, the overarching goal is to, since we're leaning more towards WYSIWYG mode as opposed to markdown mode, being able to edit what the front matter settings actually are. So there's kind of two pieces embedded within that. One is potentially up for discussion, and the first is editing raw text in markdown mode, as in what we have right now, leaving the front matter in markdown. There's actually a note that Jean linked to here where I don't know the origins of this, but the initial goal was apparently to remove that completely from markdown mode, which I personally don't think is a good idea. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts. My understanding is that it makes sense to, if we're leaving the source editing, that we should just leave everything that's in the file there so you can change it. Does anyone have any thoughts there?
I made that question. I asked that question in the first point of the milestone goals because I don't know what is the UX decision towards that. Also, I asked a follow-up question that is, what would be the influence on the technical decisions of not showing the raw from matter in the markdown mode?
Did you say what would be the advantage?
No, the influence. Like, you know, if we do not display the raw from matter in Toast UI, and we only display form controls that we're going to use to edit the from matter, like what are the consequences of that when we implement that feature?
Chad, I see.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm still catching up on the context of all of this, having been on vacation and not been involved in this part technically. But in general, like I've said before, I feel like there's a certain persona that's me that would really like to have everything still editable, regardless of the situation, because sometimes I want a nice WYSIWYG experience, but sometimes I want to just drop down and edit things raw, regardless of how easy it's made to edit through form controls or WYSIWYG.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm with you on that. So at a high level, I think I'll just make the gut call and say we'll stick with that, because if we are going to have both modes, raw should be everything. There's no real reason that I see at the moment. And again, if we get contributions from others that it does make sense to somehow make raw also exclude front matter, then we can obviously entertain that idea. But yeah, I think we should have kind of an all or nothing mode, which is raw. And then we have kind of the core goal of the whole editor is to have kind of a nice firsthand controls type of experience, right? So, so with that, I think I'll move past that one and talk about the second piece, which is
the one other
you want to add there. Yeah.
point I would make there is, even if we do eventually want to hide it, maybe even by default, still have the a super user option, which is just show me everything raw, regardless of anything else. But for the MVP, still just show it.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the comments I had related to this too, right, is, for example, even in iteration, our firsthand controls could be lacking, and then now all of a sudden you can't even edit anymore, and you're completely removed from that. Another comment I'll add to that, Chad, is yeah, again, longer vision. If it's so good that we can remove raw would then be Web IDE or another, another avenue. It wouldn't be the static site editor's responsibility to edit raw. So I could see that kind of being the future as well. There would always be that option, but maybe not within the static site editor. That's to be determined, I guess, but that's how I would potentially see that. Any other thoughts before I move on?
Yes, where are we planning to add some sort of validation for those fields? If that's the case, how the raw mode interacts with those constraints that we will implement in the UI?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. Yeah, my gut, I haven't even thought of that. That's a great question. My gut would be somehow that it would then be validated maybe on the server. Maybe we'd still do it on the front end, but we would essentially prevent the actual save from occurring. But that's a great question. I mean, the simple solution is that we don't have validation, just like anyone can edit a raw file. There's nothing, I don't know, that might be the easier solution, but longer term, that would be great to have some validation for sure, especially when we, which is further down here in the doc about when we actually have a configuration, for example. That's something we would actually be able to do some of that validation against, essentially.
Yeah, and I noticed in the design mockups that we are planning to provide some custom form controls. Like instead of having an open text field, it is a drop down with some available options, or a toggle that lets you switch between true or false. So it is like inherently constrained, the values that you can choose for those fields.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And this is Michael updated the link to the design mockups just a little bit before this meeting. So here's one example. And so that exactly is to your point. And I comment within this in terms of the 13.4 order, we would basically just do input fields to start, right, from an iteration perspective. And then in 13.5 plus, we could actually, that's when we'd introduce configuration, and we'd also introduce firsthand controls based off of the types, right? So naturally, if it's Boolean, we could provide a firsthand control of a checkbox, for example. A more unique one that's actually doesn't throw a wrench into it, but requires us to really understand the minimum and maximum of what types of edits can occur. Like an image, at least in Michael's mockup, right? Adding an image is possible. So that kind of, there's a lot that's kind of packed within that if we're going to actually enable that. So from an iteration perspective, just to reiterate, 13.4 will essentially be just having a kind of a placeholder UI that's just going to be input text. And I think I talk about it right here, actually, just labels and input fields. And then in iteration, right, we could tackle by type, improving those. So I see that that just naturally flows into an iterative process, which is nice.
The validation, now that we talk about that, makes me think of a situation where there may be some users that they really want the WYSIWYG, but they don't care about this form-based mode, or at least they don't want to have to be required to edit a configuration file just to add a new arbitrary front matter field. They may be like, I know what my front matter is, I will manage it myself. Don't make me manage this configuration file just to be able to use this WYSIWYG editor.
So when you say that, Chad,
in terms of if like you had to add an entry in there in order for a new entry to be valid, like if we say parsed it before we allowed it to be saved and said, hey, this is a new keyword that we don't know about, you have to go add it to your configuration file before you can save this in the static text editor. Some people may not like that.
Sure. Yeah, that's something so that actually reminds me of why we're actually even doing this on the front end, is because that was the argument I initially made with Jean, and then I missed last week. Obviously, it sounds like y'all had another meeting kind of that talked a little bit about this. But the reason we're doing it on the front end is because you could totally add a whole new front matter field, and then now what kind of thing. So to your point, Chad, my gut would be, and again, we'd have to figure this all out, is that maybe in raw mode, you get, it's Wild West. You can do whatever edits you need, but then when you're in WYSIWYG mode, maybe we actually do this validation constraint step, because you really got to know what you're doing. And if you really know what you're doing, you could just do it raw, maybe. I don't know.
Right. So the question there is, and again, I was out all last week. I may have missed some discussions that I haven't caught up on yet, is if you're allowed to save something invalid, what happens the next time it's loaded? Like, are you required to go fix that via some other mechanism, manually before you can load it in the static site editor or what?
Perhaps those are questions that are worth putting in the issue, so we can involve more people in the discussion.
How does adding new
Do you want me to describe so you can keep talking?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be great.
Y'all can just make sure I get them right.
Cool. And then, so yeah, but this has been a great discussion already, definitely uncovering some interesting pieces we'll have to dig into a little bit more. But in terms of the high level goal, which is essentially to have controls, which again, Michael's kind of done a mock-up here, how it actually will manifest, whether it's a sidebar above the content or whatever, was kind of TBD. It doesn't really matter for us so much in the near term. Obviously, once we actually iterate on it, it will be important where we put it, but we can very simply have a component and we can rearrange where we put that component and style it, like locationally, spatially. So I'm not concerned with that. Enrique, let me know if you're concerned with that, but I don't think that's going to be much of an issue. And again, yeah, so that's the main goal, is how do we handle this in WYSIWYG mode. So with that, I kind of have 3 core bullets for milestone 13.4, which is what we're currently in, and then some longer term, which is 13.5 plus. So I'll just go through those real quickly, and then if people have thoughts, please add. So the first one is kind of a front-end focused one. I already kind of mentioned that with the main underpinning that if someone wants to actually add something new or remove something from the front matter, more add, I guess, you'd have to do it on the front end anyway. So that's kind of where that origin of this avenue has kind of guided us. So that first kind of, and let me take a step. I think each bullet is essentially at least one MR. Obviously within these, there could be more MRs, but that's kind of also what I have to expect about this. So one MR would be front end related, where we parse out the front matter from the source markdown file. There's some additional bullets you can read here. We technically already have this working, but it's not robust in essence, that it doesn't handle different types of front matter right now. It's essentially hard coded. So that's something we'll have to expand on to enable that proper parsing. So I see that as one MR. Then the second one is, then we need to feed. So the output of that MR would essentially be, we now have an object that represents the key value pairs of what front matter actually is, and that object is then going to be fed into, likely as props, into a custom component, and that's the front. That's kind of what I dubbed the. It's here somewhere. I guess it's not super important. Front matter controls. Here it is. Front matter controls component, and so that's going to consume that object that represents what the front matter key value pairs are, and then with that, it'll dynamically generate the controls. And then the third MR, excuse me, is kind of the UI itself. What does it actually look like, right? And again, so we can just, and Enrique, you just mentioned a few minutes ago that you don't see an issue here, neither do I. We can just have kind of a dummy component that'll essentially just, v4 over all the key value pairs and just do a set of input text fields for iteration 1, and then later we can expand on that and do by type and do validation and that type of thing. So at a high level, I see kind of 3, and Michael's working on this currently. Again, you kind of link to this file so we can add some comments to the design itself. If you guys see anything interesting, definitely check that out. But other than that, I see this, again, there's always a little bit more difficult than it seems, but I guess my question would be to you, Enrique. Do you see, am I missing anything? Am I oversimplifying kind of the steps to get kind of a 13.4 iteration in of this feature?
Well, we already, even before going through those points, discussed the questions that I had that were basically about what do we do with the to sync the raw markdown mode with the form controls that we're going to build. You know, we already have even more follow-up questions that we can, well, that actually we have a decision. We're going to show the form matter in both modes. I have two more questions about the second point, that is, you know, displaying the or generating the form controls based on the form matter. So the first one is that we have like some related metadata to display those fields in the sidebar. Let's say that we want to generate those form fields based on the form matter that the components receive. But we have to display labels. Maybe we want to display label text, a help text, to further describe the those fields. So where do we store that?
That's a great question. So I see two different answers. One would be, and this is something that I was just made aware of recently. I could try to find the link. There was, I think Michael presented it in an issue where there's actually, in the front matter, you have the key and then the value, and then there's actually a hash or a pound sign, and then following that is some text. So that's basically the helper text. I don't think that solves your problem all the way, but that's like option one that I wasn't actually aware about till recently. So we could at least have helper text that way. Or metadata in that sense, and we could parse that. We could have a convention or something, but we could figure that out. The other one would be kind of the 13.5 plus, where we actually have this config file somehow enables that. It kind of has those defaults, because otherwise, yeah, I don't know where that data comes from. Like, that's a great question, but those are the two answers that I see. Do you think those would suffice, or what do you think?
But then does that mean that we're going to provide different help text for every website, or do we want to provide the same user interface for everyone? Because I imagine that the help text, for example, or the title of the title field that we set in the layout of a page, it will be the same help text for everyone. So I don't know if we are gonna force the user to define that kind of element in every application.
Sure. Excuse me. Yeah, I don't have the answer. Just spitballing. My gut would be that we'd somehow have, if it is really fed from the configuration, and again, that's part of what this is, right? It's unsolved. We need to design what that configuration is, and then how the front end consumes it. But my gut would be, it would be kind of like a two-stage thing, right? We'd have our default, and then we'd essentially have maybe an overridable file, and then that takes precedence for any matches or something. That would be my guess. But yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I've conveniently shoveled to the next thing to think about, but I don't think it's like a showstopper, right? Like, I could be wrong, but I don't think that's going to prevent us in any way from actually, we can solve it, I feel like.
Another question that I think that is worth involving Michael is if we actually want to allow the user to customize those UI elements. Like, do we want to allow the user to provide a custom label, a custom help text, or we want to follow a simpler route and just, you know, provide a default label and default help text for all fields? So that could be the case, that we just want to provide a simple user interface, and it makes our work simpler from the engineering point of view.
Yeah, so kind of to that point, like the option one that I referred to, where there's actually the key value, then a hash, and then, or a pound sign, and then a comment. It's basically comment syntax following. We could just parse that, and that becomes the help text. That's the simple approach. I think that solves your simplicity comment. Like, that's the simple approach, and the configuration file is the more robust, complex approach, I guess. That's kind of how I see that.
I could see a couple of comments. First of all, having a default text, it may work for some things like title, but for other fields, that may not always work because certain rendering engines or tools or whatever may interpret different fields differently. Like we can't necessarily predict if we're only using supporting a subset of tools to start with, maybe that's okay. But going forward, I think the config file approach, having an entry to, like maybe there's very simple ones that we provide defaults for, but the rest come out of the config file. And the second comment is, as far as parsing the comment after the pound sign for each line, that's maybe not necessarily the description of the field. Like often,
Sure.
and even in existing files in the handbook, that may be some comments about like the value, like some specific notes about the implementation of that value or why they used it. So long term, I almost see that evolving into a separate data type, which is like a comment, which could be optional, and it's about that particular field in that file. And because long term, you wouldn't want to have every single, title field in every document have to have that after it,
That's a great point. And just to comment again, like that's just something I saw recently and was like, oh, that's what it's for. But to your point, it's actually could be a code comment and have no real. That's literally probably what it was or is, and it doesn't really have. There isn't any real reason for it to. There was never an initial intention for it to show up in a UI. So that could be a total no-go essentially. That could just be a bad approach. Totally.
And also that's something you want to be really concerned about in the early stages, is like changing the meaning of one field, because we don't want to encourage people to put a bunch of unnecessary text describing the what the field is, when later we want to change the meaning of that to what the value is. So I was.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay, you're putting that
I
down
just
there.
added a bullet to the 13.5 plus when we designed the configuration. It like, just from this small conversation right here, it sounds like that's going to be the main driver for kind of the metadata about those fields. Is that sufficient, Enrique? Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And also, I think that I know was understanding correctly the idea of where the metadata of the field exists. I was like thinking about putting that metadata in the front matter of each page, and it's actually in the configuration file for the file, right? For the website.
Yes,
that makes a lot of sense.
I think that does too. So it's almost just to kind of do a quick mini recap. Obviously, things can change. Is my comment around option 1, which is the comment syntax being a help text. Probably we don't even want to do that, is what it sounds like, and it would just be all in a configuration file. And we'll provide a default, and we could provide a mechanism. Again, we'll leave this in 13.5 plus to solve exactly how to do that, but we have a rough path of have a default config, and we'll likely provide some kind of overridable mechanism for them to also do that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And what could also be nice about that naturally, right, is it could feed into, we actually did this on Meltano, actually. We had our YAML file was kind of the God file, if you will, that informed what types of controls, all kinds of metadata we wanted about doing this exact thing, about automatically generating controls. So there's definitely it's not brand new to do that type of thing. And then go for it, John.
I was just going to say that the one thought I had, I know that adding the configuration file may not be in the first iteration, but it's not going to be that hard technically, like on the back or the front end, I don't think. So we should be careful about making decisions that might end up being as much or more work or lock us into suboptimal approaches just because we don't want to implement a config file in their first iteration.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We'll since Enrique and I are both kind of like probably leading this thing or working the most on it, like that'll be kind of top of mind. But that's a great point. Don't make any decisions that'll shoot us in the foot. So and that's part of what this process is, kind of having a little bit of foresight into where we're going, so we don't do that. Enrique, did your second did this question get answered as well?
Yes. Yes, I think so. I guess that the answer would be, if we want to support a new file, a new field actually. I guess that what we would do is, well, I imagine that the way that we are delivering the configuration file or the configuration of a site to the site editor application is like in some form of serialized object, right? The backend will take that YAML file from the repository. It will interpret it. It will take the metadata that is populating the form in the sidebar. And then it's transforming that into something that the front end can interpret, even though that is defined in YAML. So I imagine that we will have like some sort of default configuration object in the backend, where if we want to support a new field, we just add it in that place, right? Or what happens, let's say that we have a front matter with 5 fields and we don't support the 5th one. How do we display that?
My gut would be, and this just comes directly from, it's a little bit fresh with Meltano, is we just basically had a kind of a baseline, which would probably just default to like an input field, right? You would just allow some kind of base way to actually do the editing. So it would be lacking compared to a control above it. The 4th one, as you mentioned, that would have all the metadata to be a particular rich type of control, have, you know, help text, whatever other metadata that's useful. And then this 5th one that's new, it would just be an input field, raw. Or we could disable it even if we, you know, UX wise, depending what we think makes the most sense. Looks like Enrique just dropped internet wise.
Yeah, so while he's getting back in the discussion at the top, I added a couple of questions that are related to this,
Cool.
like, what about user personas that don't want to be required to edit a config file to have a new field, or will new unknown fields be automatically supported? That's under the validation section here, but it's maybe I'm
I'm adding a comment. Like basically what I just said, I think, unless you disagree, like we shouldn't not prevent them, most likely, and just have just an input field. And it still has to go through approval, right? So at the end of the day, you know, there's a person approving this edit to the live site, I think. But
I'm just going to refer to those questions from here, from this point.
Sorry, guys. Internet connection issues.
Sure. I just said that I'd already put a couple of questions that were related to this above under the discussion, technical solution validation discussion. So I just said to refer to those. For example, like what if you don't want to be required to edit a config file to have a new field, or what will new or unknown fields be handled automatically, or are you required to edit the config file, stuff like that. I think it's related to this question.
So like a path that would be kind of a further down the line, right? As if we assumed that if you're adding it, you kind of know what you're doing, we could potentially automatically update the source just as is of what they did. And then in addition, kick off an automatic write to the config file itself to update it to handle that in some way or something with defaults. I don't know. Maybe that's a bad idea, but that's kind of an extreme thing we could do.
I think it's depending on the organization. Like in some places they may say, yes, I'm never going to put a field in that I don't know I want. Whereas in other organizations, we may really want to validate and prevent people from adding new ones.
Essentially, yeah. Editing raw or being a developer or something like that is probably more, that's kind of, I don't want to say gatekeeping, but like, you know what I mean? Like they kind of know what they're doing potentially more so in terms of that. So we might just leave that type of edit for that type of scenario or something. Okay, so are we, before we hit this UI bullet, does anyone have anything else from above regarding 13.4?
In general, I think we should just try to do the simplest thing around this. Like maybe, does the first iteration, is it required to have the UI component? Or can we just sort of put some of the plumbing and parsing and stuff out there when there's not necessarily having to make these decisions about the visual UI?
So there's, to answer your question, the plan right now is to have the UI component, but it's just going to iterate through the object that gets generated and simply provide just labels and inputs, and not worry anything about metadata, not worry about what types of controls they actually are. And that would be a simple stopping point to then, okay, iterate on, right? And handle, once we actually get to 13.5 and actually have time to think through, how do we actually want to solve this? I think it's a natural cutting off point, in my opinion. So there's a sense
all
of
these questions of, oh, sorry.
Go for it.
All these questions about validation, they're not relevant to 13.4 as given the current plan.
Pretty much, okay. Yeah. So like, yeah, the kind of 3 core MRs that I envision is, one is the proper, we're already extracting markdown. We just want to, extend on that to do different types of markdown and actually create that object. And then the second piece is the dummy UI that consumes that object, or a dummy or a component that consumes that object and just spits out labels and input fields. Like that's the gist. And then the UI is, what do we actually want it to look like? We can then, that'll be maybe the next iteration, or if Michael actually has that kind of solved, that will inform exactly what that component looks like stylistically and spatially within the UI. And then resync and reevaluate, which would likely be within 13.4, to be honest, timing wise, I would expect. Like, I don't see that being a ton of work, could be wrong. But I just grouped it that way so that 13.5 is more about, okay, now how do we actually want to do this configuration file? That's my rough plan anyway.
So probably then the simplest thing that we can do is just display, for example, use as labels the field name of the front, or in the front matter, right? Exactly.
Yep. Yeah. The key is the label, and the value is just auto fed into the input text field. That's how I expect that.
That makes sense. Cool. And then we don't have to worry about any of these things you've been discussing.
Exactly. And again, yeah, iteration. That's what it's there for. That's a good natural cutoff point, which is nice. So that's cool. So then, yeah, UI wise, definitely check out Michael's design, which we have here. Like, we can actually, this can help us make some decisions when we get to 13.5. Right now, we're just going to do exactly this. But, label, and then the value. Label, value, label, value. That's what we'll do for this 13.4.
I'm assuming this image thing is not in scope for 13.4. Like,
correct. Yeah,
this would be a text field.
Yep. Because again, yeah, that's actually one I just saw this morning of, I didn't even know that was an option. So we basically, yeah, 13.5. So we can skip to 13.5. So in terms of looking forward, the next iteration would be, how do we do the config file? How do we handle all the, like, that's where we would actually put forth the effort of knowing the minimum and maximum of what's all actually possible in front matter, and how do we want to handle on a case-by-case basis. I would actually anticipate probably when we do that, we would kind of have an MR per type, like MR to handle Boolean switches, like toggles, an MR to handle images, for example. That one actually probably is going to be a little bit more complicated, to be honest, but we'll have to see. Like, where does that image actually go? Where do we temporarily upload it? Is it a base 64, what have you? And then in 13.5, yeah, the other MR that I envision. So that's kind of I put back end here, but it's, you know, we'll obviously all work together to figure out what makes the most sense naturally. As that configuration payload hits the front end, what it should be, it's that type of thing. And then another MR I anticipate being the front matter controls component that we currently have in 13.4. How do we, you know, iterate on that to actually handle the unique controls, consume the metadata? Pretty straightforward. And that's exactly what I talk about here in this one too, is by type, we'll probably have an MR per type of config. And that's basically it. That's how I kind of expect this panning out.
Yeah, I've got lots of ideas of how it could work, and so I look forward to the upcoming discussions.
Yep, cool. Yeah,
I think it's going to come down to a balance between, you know, letting power users staying out of their way, but still providing some of these features like validation and preventing non-developer users from entering invalid values and stuff like that.
I agree, and I think that's why at least one outcome of this is discussion one. Like, I think it's almost, unless the members who aren't here have some really solid pushback, I think it makes a whole lot of sense to keep raw. There really is no reason to pluck it out of raw, in our opinion. So I think that's a good outcome. Alrighty, so with that, I think that's it. I don't know if you guys have any closing thoughts. Other than that, I think I might end it.
Nope.
Cool. Alrighty, thank you all for listening.
Bye.
I'll upload this as well. See ya.